My name is Robert Callahan. I am a retired high school history teacher from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And I have spent 41 years of my life believing that the most important thing I could give another person was an accurate account of what actually happened. History does not forgive embellishment. I taught my students that for 4 decades. I told them that the truth, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it does not fit the story we wanted, is the only foundation worth building anything on. So when I tell you that on the night of March 7th, 2018, I was pulled from the wreckage of my car on Interstate 10 outside of Baton Rouge with 3 broken ribs, a fractured pelvis, a collapsed lung, and a traumatic brain injury, and that while my body was being extracted from that wreckage, I was somewhere else entirely, having a conversation with a being of light who told me things that I have spent 6 years trying to find the right words for. I need you to understand that I am applying the same standard to this account that I applied to every primary source I ever put in front of a classroom. I am telling you what happened. I am not embellishing. I am, if anything, being conservative, because the full reality of what I experienced exceeds what language can responsibly contain. Let me tell you who Robert Callahan was before Interstate 10. I grew up in New Orleans, the second of 5 children in an Irish Catholic family that took both the Irish and the Catholic seriously. My father worked for the city water department for 38 years. My mother was the kind of woman who could feed 7 people on a budget that should have fed 4 and make everyone feel that they had eaten well, which is a form of genius that does not get sufficient recognition. We were loud and loving and opinionated in the specific manner of large New Orleans families, where dinner table conversation is a contact sport and silence is considered mildly suspicious. I went to Loyola University, New Orleans on a partial scholarship, majored in history because it was the subject that made me feel most like I understood something true about the human condition, and started teaching at a public high school in Baton Rouge in 1977. I taught there for 41 years. I taught the same survey course in American history to approximately 3,000 students over 4 decades, and I never once taught it the same way twice, because history kept happening, and the context kept changing, and a good teacher, I believed, paid attention to both. I retired in 2018, 4 months before the accident, which means I spent the last years of my career looking forward to a retirement that arrived at the same time as the worst night of my life, which is the kind of timing that would have made my father say, "Robert, God has a sense of humor, and it is not always subtle." I was married to Patricia for 43 years. Patricia was a court reporter who had transcribed an estimated 4 million words of legal proceedings and who had, as a result, a relationship with accuracy that matched and occasionally exceeded my own. We had 3 children: Sean, who was a firefighter in New Orleans, Kathleen, who was a pharmacist in Baton Rouge, and the youngest, Danny, who was 31 in 2018 and working in commercial real estate in Houston. 6 grandchildren between the 3 of them, ranging in age from 2 to 14. Patricia and I had plans for retirement that involved, in roughly equal measure, travel and grandchildren, which seemed to us a reasonable and complete program for the years ahead. I need to say something about my faith because it shaped the lens through which I experienced everything that happened, and I want to be honest about what that faith actually consisted of rather than presenting a tidier version of it. I was Catholic in the way that people who were raised Catholic by serious Catholics are Catholic. It was not something I chose. It was something I was, the way I was Irish and Southern and a history teacher. I went to Mass. I prayed, with varying degrees of attention and sincerity over the decades. I believed in God in the way that a fish believes in water, as the medium of existence rather than a specific object of intellectual inquiry. I believed in angels the way I believed in the resurrection, as doctrinal facts that I had neither confirmed nor seriously challenged, that sat in the background of my faith like load-bearing walls I had never thought to test. I thought I believed in guardian angels. I did not know what believing in them actually meant until March 7th, 2018. It is a Wednesday night. I am driving home from a retirement dinner that some former colleagues had organized. A generous and somewhat overlong event at a Baton Rouge steakhouse that I had genuinely appreciated and from which I was returning on Interstate 10 westbound at approximately 10:15 p.m. I am 64 years old, and I have been driving this stretch of highway for 37 years, and I know it as well as I know my own street. The night is clear. I am not tired, or I did not believe I was tired, which is a distinction that matters. What the accident reconstruction report later determined was that a commercial truck carrying industrial pipe fittings had experienced a rear axle failure approximately 200 yards ahead of my position. Several of the pipe fittings, inadequately secured following the axle failure, had distributed themselves across the westbound lanes of Interstate 10 in a pattern that the report described with the careful objectivity of people who were not in any of the vehicles that subsequently encountered them. I see something in my headlights, not in time. The word time is doing too much work in that sentence. What I mean is that the interval between seeing and impact was shorter than the interval between seeing and responding, and no amount of driving experience closes that gap. The first impact, my right front tire encountering a 12-pound pipe fitting at highway speed, produces a blowout and a loss of directional control that the second impact, the median barrier, converts into something the accident report calls a rollover event, and that I would call the most violent 30 seconds of physical experience available to a human being who survives it. The car rolls twice. There is a third impact with a concrete drainage structure that the report describes as significant, and that my pelvis, 3 ribs, and left lung describe in more personal terms. I want to tell you about the inside of those 30 seconds because I think it matters. There is no time to be afraid. I want to say that clearly because I think people imagine a car accident as an experience that includes a period of terror, a period of impact, and a period of aftermath. The actual experience collapses all three into something that the word simultaneous does not fully capture. The glass and the noise and the rotation and the impact are not sequential. They are concurrent, a single, overwhelming event that the nervous system receives without having the bandwidth to narrate. What I am aware of, in the final fraction of the final impact, is 2 things. The first is Patricia. Not a memory of Patricia, her actual presence, the specific quality of her, arriving in the way that the people who matter most to us sometimes arrive in extremity, not as images, but as the full reality of what they mean. The second thing I am aware of is a stillness arriving inside the violence, like a room of silence opening inside a thunderstorm. And that stillness is the threshold. I am no longer in the car. I want to be careful about how I describe the transition because I think the quality of it is important. It was not dramatic. It was not a tunnel or a rushing sound or a sensation of ascending. It was more like a correction, as if the violence of the accident had been an error in the natural order, and what followed was the natural order reasserting itself. The car and the concrete and the glass and the interstate were the interruption. Where I arrived was the continuation. The space I was in had no physical properties that I can describe with confidence. What it had was quality, a quality of reality more complete and more precise than anything I had experienced in 64 years of what I had previously considered real experience. If I had to find an analogy in my professional life, I would say it was the difference between reading about a historical event and being present at it. I had spent 41 years trying to make history feel real to students who had only read about it. What I was now inside was something that made ordinary life feel like the reading. The light was present, and I am not going to elaborate on the light beyond saying that it was consistent with every NDE account I have since read, and that describing it feels like trying to describe the taste of water. True, but insufficient. What I want to tell you about is who was in it. The being was beside me. Not above me, not at a distance, not presented with the visual grammar of a religious painting. Beside me. The way a person stands beside you when they want you to know that they are with you, rather than observing you. And I knew, with the instantaneous quality of knowing that the NDE space seems to produce in everyone who has been there, that this being had been beside me before. Not just in this moment, always. For 64 years of living, and for whatever existed before the 64 years. Always beside me. The recognition was the most disorienting and most settling thing I have ever experienced simultaneously. I am going to try to describe the being, and I am going to fail, and I am going to try anyway. There was light to it, but the light was not the primary thing. The primary thing was attention. The being's attention was entirely and completely on me, not in the way of an authority examining a subject, but in the way of someone who has loved you your entire life and is glad you are here. There was a quality of knowing me that went further back and further in than any human knowing I had experienced, including Patricia's, which was the deepest human knowing available to me, and which this exceeded the way the ocean exceeds a swimming pool. Not cruelly, not comparatively, simply in scale. It communicated, not in words. I want to be specific about this because I am a history teacher, and words have been the medium of my professional life, and the absence of them in this communication was itself significant. What arrived was complete understanding, the way light arrives, not sequentially, but all at once, filling whatever space it enters. And the first thing that arrived was the answer to a question I had not known I was carrying. I had not known, until that moment, in that space, how afraid I had been. Not of the accident, of being unknown, of being, at my deepest level, unseen. I had spent 64 years being seen in my roles: the teacher, the father, the husband, the history expert, the reliable one, the man who showed up. And I had confused being seen in those roles with being known as myself. What the being showed me, simply by the quality of its attention, was that those are different things, and that the thing I was actually afraid of, being truly known and found wanting, was not a risk in this space, because what was doing the knowing had already seen everything, had always seen everything, and was not alarmed by any of it. There was a life review. Mine arrived with a particular texture that I think a history teacher's life review would arrive. As a complete record, every moment present, available for examination, nothing redacted. I did not experience it as judgment. I experienced it as the most honest historical document I had ever been given access to, which was also somehow the most loving document I had ever been given access to, which is a combination that does not make logical sense in ordinary life, and made complete sense there. What I saw was the pattern, not individual moments scored as successes or failures, but the pattern of a life, where the genuine care had flowed and where it had been withheld, where I had been truly present and where I had been present in the logistical sense while being somewhere else in the meaningful sense. The classroom moments where I had cared about a specific struggling student and stayed after the bell and watched something shift in them, those moments were in the pattern with a weight I had not attributed to them while they were happening. The nights I had come home from school tired and given Patricia the leftover version of my attention, those were in the pattern too, not as condemnations, but as information about what the pattern could have been. Danny was in there. Danny, my youngest, who had gone through a period in his mid-20s that had frightened us, and who had come out the other side stronger, but who had needed, in the middle of it, a kind of presence from me that I had found difficult to sustain. I saw that clearly in the review, the moments I had offered advice when he needed company, the moments I had managed my own discomfort about his struggle by becoming practical when he needed me to simply stay. I felt that in the review from his side. I want to tell you it was not comfortable. I also want to tell you that it was held in that space by something so much larger than the inadequacy that the inadequacy could not define the story. The being communicated several specific things. I call them specific because they arrived with a specificity that generic spiritual concepts do not have. Shaped for me, for Robert Callahan, for a history teacher from Baton Rouge who had spent his life valuing accuracy. The first was this: every person who passed through your classroom was not an accident. Each one was specifically placed. The influence you had on those 3,000 students was not random. It was the work you were here to do, and it was received in ways you were not present to witness and will not know the full scope of until you return here completely. The second was about the being itself. I asked, not in words, but in the way that questions form in that space, as complete intentions rather than sentences. I asked who it was. And what arrived was not a name. What arrived was a knowing. That this being had been assigned to me, that assigned is the closest English word for a relationship that predates my birth and will continue past my death. That its purpose was not to prevent all difficulty, but to ensure that no difficulty was ever faced entirely alone. That every moment in 64 years when I had felt in the middle of something hard, a quality of steadiness that I could not account for. That quality had a source, and the source was here beside me, and it had never once left. I want to be honest about what I felt when I received that. I wept. I do not know if weeping is possible without a body, but I wept, or something that was the full equivalent of weeping occurred in whatever I was using in place of a body. Because the accumulation of 64 years of not knowing that was beside me, and then knowing it arrived with a force that had nowhere to go except out. The third thing the being communicated was the reason for returning. Not a choice. I want to be clear about that. I was not offered a choice in the way some NDE accounts describe. What I was given was an understanding. Patricia. Danny, specifically Danny, who was not yet finished needing me in ways I did not yet know. The grandchildren, 3 of whom were old enough for me to be a presence in their actual memory rather than a story their parents told. There was work remaining, not dramatic work, daily work. The work of being a husband and a grandfather and the specific person who stood beside Danny when Danny needed someone to stand beside him without trying to fix him. The being communicated one final thing, and it was delivered with the specificity and clarity of a primary source document. the kind I had spent 41 years telling my students were the most reliable form of historical evidence. You have never been alone, not once, not in the hardest moment of your hardest year. The presence that has been beside you since before you had a name will be beside you until after you no longer need one. This is not comfort. This is history. This is history. A history teacher receiving that. I do not have the words. I came back into the car the way I imagine a letter comes back into an envelope. Returned to a container that is the right size, but that the contents have outgrown. The pain arrived before the awareness of the pain arrived, which is a neurological phenomenon I later read about, but which, experienced from the inside, is simply the body saying, I am still here, and I have a report to file. There were voices, first responders, the specific, controlled urgency of people trained to manage situations that are not manageable. Someone was saying my name. Someone was saying, do not move. The night air coming through what used to be the windshield was cold and clean and present in the way that air becomes present to a person who has briefly not been breathing it. They extracted me with equipment that I later learned took 45 minutes to operate properly. I was conscious for approximately half of that process, which I experienced with the particular combination of physical agony and existential serenity that I imagine is not common in accident extractions, and that the paramedics later described as the most unsettling patient composure they had encountered. Patricia was at Our Lady of the Lake Regional Medical Center when I arrived. She had been called by the state police and had driven to the hospital with Kathleen, who lived 12 minutes from the house and who had arrived at our door within 8 minutes of the call, because Kathleen has always been the child who moves fastest in a crisis. Patricia was in the waiting room when they brought me in, and I could see her face from the gurney. And whatever the expression on my face was in return, she told me later that it was not the expression of a man who was afraid, and that this frightened her more than the blood and the equipment and the medical personnel surrounding me, because she had never in 43 years seen me not afraid of something I had good reason to fear. I spent 17 days at Our Lady of the Lake, 2 surgeries, one for the pelvis, one for the collapsed lung. 12 days before, I was moved from intensive care. Rehabilitation beginning in the hospital and continuing for 8 months after discharge. My orthopedic surgeon, Dr. James Fontenot, told me during a follow-up visit 3 months after discharge that the injury pattern from the accident, specifically the combination of pelvic fracture and pulmonary collapse in a 64-year-old patient, had statistical outcomes that did not generally include this particular follow-up appointment. I told him I had received some assistance. He was a thoughtful man, and he did not dismiss this. I told Patricia everything on day 4, when I was coherent enough to sustain the telling and when the quality of her waiting beside my bed had become something I could no longer leave unanswered. She is a court reporter. She received the account the way a court reporter receives testimony, with complete attention, without interruption, with the discipline of a person who has learned that the most important part of listening is not preparing your response while the other person is still speaking. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Robert, I have prayed for your protection every night for 43 years. She stopped. Then she said, "I would like to know its name." I told her I did not receive a name. She said that was all right. She said she had been praying to it by description for 4 decades, and it had clearly known who she meant. I called Danny from the hospital on day 6. He drove from Houston that night and was at my bedside the following morning. We had a conversation that I am not going to reproduce here in full because it belongs to him as much as it belongs to me. But I will tell you that it was the conversation that the life review had shown me we still needed to have, and that having it was the most important thing I did in my first 17 days of the life I was given back. Sean came from New Orleans. Kathleen was in and out every day. The grandchildren visited in carefully managed shifts organized by Patricia with the logistical precision of a woman who understands that a hospital room has a capacity and that the relevant capacity is emotional rather than square footage. My oldest grandchild, 14-year-old Bridget, sat beside my bed for 20 minutes on her visit and held my hand and did not speak, which was more company than most adults know how to provide. The integration took longer than I expected for a man who had considered himself reasonably self-aware. I went back to Sunday Mass with a quality of attention I had not previously brought to it, which Patricia noticed and did not comment on directly, but which she acknowledged by occasionally reaching over during the homily and taking my hand without looking at me, which is the Patricia Callahan equivalent of a standing ovation. I speak at my parish now, occasionally, to groups that are interested in hearing the account: grief groups, RCIA classes, a men's group that meets on Thursday mornings and that receive the story with the particular combination of skepticism and hunger that men who have been raised to be skeptical of things they hunger for tend to bring to these conversations. I am not an evangelist. I am a history teacher with a primary source document that I believe is reliable and that I think people have a right to hear. Danny is doing well. I will say that simply and leave the rest of it where it belongs, which is between Danny and me and the presence that has been beside both of us longer than either of us knew. Here is what I want to leave with you from a history teacher who was extracted from a car on Interstate 10 and given back the rest of his life. You are not alone. I do not mean that in the generalized motivational poster sense. I mean it as a specific, verifiable historical fact. There is a presence that has been beside you since before you had a name. It has been there in the hardest moments of your hardest years. It was there on the nights you lay awake at 3 a.m, convincing yourself that the weight was yours alone to carry. It was there, and it is here, and it will be there at the end when the end comes, which it will, for all of us, and which is nothing to fear. We spend so much of our lives feeling unseen, feeling that the deepest version of us, not the role, not the achievement, not the face we show to the world, but the actual thing underneath all of that, the thing that has been continuous through every version of us we have ever been. We spend so much time afraid that if that thing were fully seen, it would be found wanting. I am telling you, from a place past the windshield and the concrete and the darkness of an interstate in March, that it has been fully seen. It has always been fully seen, and it is not found wanting. It is found, simply and completely and without revision, found. We are known, every one of us, down to the places we have never shown anyone. And we are not alone in those places, and we have never been alone in those places. And the thing that has been beside us in those places is made of something that does not leave and does not tire and does not find us too much. We are going home to that, all of us. And the going is not the end. It is the reunion with the presence that has walked beside us every step of the way here, waiting with the patience of something that exists outside of time to show us what we always hoped was true. You are loved, completely, without condition and without limit. That is the only history that matters. And unlike most of history, it has a very good ending.